Welcome to the 6th of 7 videos from the Roman Army 2021 UofW lecture on social origins and recruitment. This one is all about training. So I've said a bit about the origins of soldiers and recruits and a bit about the process and the evidence for it in the law and Vegetius, and I said promotion already, say it again. So this one, training, and this will tell us a little bit about what soldiers did in the day-to-day, how they made sure they were ready to fight or whatever else they would do, and gave you some idea maybe of why they were successful. Okay, so training for the rank and file soldiers, more or less. And of course, things are different if you're an officer in the elite and so on. And there are always exceptions and different circumstances and so on. Okay, so there's a lot of, as all these topics, there's a lot of research. This is a small snippet. Okay, so literary sources have a lot to say about training, and perhaps not surprisingly, Josephus, who has one of the most famous discussions of the Roman military in the early to high imperial era, and he spends a lot of time talking about the training. Vegetius, too, whom we've already met as well, has a lot to say about training. To give you one little snippet, as my head starts to pound, too much screen time, best to be in person. He says, to give you some idea of Vegetius' views, which you might have read by now, we see that the Roman people conquered the world by no other means than training in the military arts, discipline in the camp, and practice in warfare. But against all these peoples we triumphed by selecting recruits carefully, we discussed, by teaching them, which we're going to discuss, as I have pointed out, the principles of war, by toughening them by daily exercise, as we're about to get to, by teaching them advanced or maneuvers in the field, everything which can happen on the march and in battle, and by punishing severely the lazy. For knowledge of military science fosters courage in battle. No one is afraid to perform what he is confident he has learned well. Okay, thank you, Vegetius. Okay, so there is, and in some way we're getting into like the intellectual side of the military and military affairs, as well as how Romans saw other professions and jobs, etc. So, disciplina militaris, these Latin words, sort of like military discipline, but discipline in a broader sense, less like the you've done a bad thing, I'm going to punish you discipline, and more like the discipline of orthopedics or something. Anyway, so there is a view, as Vegetius espouses, that military matters is something that could be taught, a bit like a science, maybe less like an arts. And as I say, we have a lot of evidence of this, but not just the military handbooks. I mean, they have a lot to say how a phalanx should be organized, what a general should do, whatever. And Campbell, again, who wrote this book, also wrote a very good journal article about how to be general. It talks about some of this. We have inscriptions. Some of these are quite fascinating. One of the most relevant for this, and it'd be great if I had an example of it here, comes from Hadrian. So Hadrian, emperor, 2nd century CE, 117 to 138. He traveled the world. There's a great following Hadrian blog and pictures, etc. you can check out. But one of the things he left behind is this inscription in North Africa. And in this inscription, it talks about his visit, and he sort of saw the soldiers. They went on parade, and it hints at some of the exercises, the sort of training / parade ground exercises they did for his benefit while they were inspected. Arrian, an author I've mentioned, I think, when I talked about sources, so he wrote about Alexander the Great, but he also wrote about tactics and how to defeat the Alans. He also has a bit to say on this, just to give you some examples. Now, one of the things hinted at in that passage, of course, combat training. Obviously, what is an army for? What are soldiers for? Well, the number one thing that they're for, and when there was all this research produced on the experience of battle, John Keegan's Face of Battle, and then Goldsworthy, Hansen, they're all going on about, well, there's a lot of stuff on war and society, but what does a soldier do? What a soldier does is fight. So, in order to be ready to fight, in theory, you want to train. And so they did a fair bit of training, swords, javelins, spears, shields. They marched, they did maneuvers, as he said. They did things to improve their physical fitness, and they even engaged in some mock battles, some of which we know about. It seems, as it's hard to say. We're drawing on literary accounts, etc., and based on some comments in Vegetius and others. Maybe real weapons weren't used in some parts of training. Instead, wooden weapons and wicker shields, Vegetius says. And the idea was in part to improve fitness and skill with these implements, these tools, these weapons. So soldiers would use things that were heavier than usual. So when you got to use the real thing, it would feel light and you'd be like, oh, this is nothing. One-on-one combat, there's, hints, I don't know if it's all BS, but again, in the book, when I talk about background, one of the starting points, of course, is Marius. One of the things Marius is said to have done is to have, made gladiatorial style training, sort of. A key part of a soldier's training is continued, or at least this kind of sword play and so on. A weirtus is this virtue or courage at the moment I've been reading about in a big book that talks about war discourses in the Greek and Roman world. It's massive. It goes on forever. So weirtus was this important Roman virtue connected to warfare, to both the soldier and to the emperor and commanders. And by training well and performing well in combat, you can display your weirtus, which goes down well with everyone else. If you do a lot of training, hopefully the theory was this would prepare you for the rigors of combat, potentially if it ever happened, desensitize you to possible violence. My point there about thrust rather than slash is wrong. I need to change that. They both thrusted and slashed. But they wanted to promote soldiers who confronted their foe rather than retreated as well. And there are laws about, don't bail in battle. And there were other things they did too. There was some swimming, jumping, and use a variety of weapons. Okay. Now, as far as where they train, it seems a lot of Roman military bases, forts, fortlets, etc., had specific training grounds, a campus. Okay, so possibly hinting at one here. At least there seems to have been one found in Lambysis, which is in North Africa. Ideally, this training facility would be built on a plain. There could be many of them. They could be purpose built. The one at Lambysis, which is very well preserved in North Africa, is rectangular, had stone walls, had a podium of a sort. So it had all these features to make training easier. Okay, now there were, besides the physical and the combat maneuvers and the weapons and stuff, there were other kinds of training or other things in the day-to-day that maybe could provide benefit, same kind of benefit training would. So weight training, for instance, leveling terrain. The Romans are known for their civil engineering, the Roman legionaries especially. You can see here in this little shot of Trajan's column where they're building stuff, okay? Physicality, building monuments. They help quarrying. They might actually construct things. Hadrian's Wall part, they have workshops. They made bricks, and we have lots of brick tile stamps that indicate where soldiers are from. So all sorts of other things they might do, which provide a different kind of training, you could say. So ends the 6th video, looking at sort of training of the rank and file soldiers, more or less over time.